regarding the presentation or the film, any aspect that you found interesting. Anybody wants to start? Here? Anyone has a question regarding the presentation?
My question is actually regarding future of cinema in Canada. Do you see any future for Canadian cinema, or we're gonna stay dependent to America?
Oh, I think Connie spent 25 years answering that question in her magazine. Well, the bad news is when the feature film started being subsidized in the mid-1960s, the goal was to have all the film screens in Canada showing 3% of the films would be Canadian. And in English Canada, we've never achieved that goal. I think it was at some point even modified down to 2%, which we still haven't achieved. So in that strict sense of it, will the number of feature films in the theaters you go to ever be primarily Canadian? I don't think so. In Quebec, it's much better. Sometimes it's 20% of the films in Quebec screens are actually made in Quebec, and Quebec has a much stronger tradition of supporting its films. But in English Canada, probably not. And this has been true since really almost the beginnings of Hollywood, is that the Canadian theaters have been dominated by American feature filmmaking. And there are many reasons for it. One is unfortunately our languages are so similar that there's no problem in translation. The Hollywood industry has always considered Canada part of the American market when it adds up all the totals of film sales, and it has lobbied the Canadian governments for the last almost 100 years to make sure that there's no problem with that Canadian American films will always come in here and be shown as freely as any films made in Canada, certainly, probably more so because they have more publicity and more screens, and our coverage of the cinema is every bit as concerned with American film as anybody else's. And I suppose that there's a kind of adage that everybody in the world lives in two cultures, their own and the Americans. And that's because America's cultural exports are up there with its food and industrial products and everything else as a major industry. Hollywood has always been very good at exporting and has always depended on exports for its revenues. So in those terms, no, I don't think we'll ever see more than, I hope someday we'll get to 3% of features on feature film screens. But that being said, we have generated a much bigger industry than we used to have in this country. And it's not just the American filmmakers who come to Canada to make films, but because we have facilities to make films here, we have trained people to make films. It is much easier to make a film within Canada than it used to be, because we have so much talent up here now. You can make a film from beginning to end in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, which wasn't true even, I think, 25 years ago. All of the specialties are there, and all the labs, and all of the digital effects, and the cameramen and soundmen, and all the vast crews you see at as the titles run at the end of a film for 10 minutes. All of those, we have those now here, and that is always good news. So people who can raise the cash to make a feature film can do it in Canada. And then the second piece of good news, I think, is that the feature film business isn't the only game in town anymore. And that because of cable television, because of the greater ability of people to make films on low budget, distribute them, and get publicity through YouTube, or have them on Vimeo, or or have their work at least seen, and have spontaneous success with social media. You can hope at least that you can put a product together and then have people look at it and then move on to a larger career. And so there's a lot of other things going on from cable television and movies for television, really down to very low budget independent work that gets seen. We've had a student, I'm not just bragging about York because it's happened in other places, but we've just had one of our students, a fourth-year film project, screened at the Locarno Film Festival. He made a feature, I don't know how and where he got the start himself and his friends. And it's just a very witty little film made for almost nothing, but people are interested in it. So we can do that kind of thing here. And in that sense, I think there's reason for optimism.
Yeah, I have actually two questions, and I hope it's not too long. But the first kind of general question is regarding your specialty, as Connie introduced you in before and this session about Vertov cinema. I want to try to understand the connection between that kind of experimental Russian cinema, if I may, with the Canadian cinema, if there is any connection, to understand your interest in that. And that's my first question, kind of general question. But second question is kind of built on that, is basically, I was thinking about Man with a Movie Camera, accidentally made by Vertov.
Yeah.
And that movie is actually as technical, or maybe more technical. Like the techniques that's used there is kind of similar to this movie, right? But the zoom in, zoom out, and the type of the different lenses, even the movements, and accidentally some of the shots. But I think I get a feeling that for a movie by made in 1929, that movie is much more kind of, maybe it's personal, but it's interesting to me, since the techniques that are used was in a right medium to show the objectivity of the characters. Here, as you said, there is an element of judgment when we zoom into characters, not just the culture, but even people. So it's, in a sense, we're dominating the people's emotions, and that's imposing on the audience in a simplistic way. So I just want to know if you agree that one of the reasons that the movie is kind of disinteresting and maybe boring, if I may, is that it's using that kind of documentary techniques to be objective in a drama that doesn't fit.
Boy, you raised a lot of questions, and
sorry.
It's well, look. You learn in academics you can connect anything to anything else, and a lot of people do. So I don't think there's a simple answer whether Vertov is pointed this way. There's if you want, there's kind of biographical evidence, in the sense that what Michel Brault, the cinematographer, was doing for Jean Rouch is called cinema verite, as a quotation of what Vertov was doing in the 1920s, because he did a newsreel series called Kino Glace, which translates into French as cinema verite, which means cinema truth. I'm sorry, he did a series called Kino Pravda, which translates as cinema verite, which translates as cinema truth. Mm-hmm. So there's that very direct kind of connection, if you want, and there's the more general connection you cited, that Vertov believed in the camera being able to go anywhere and look at anything, and that his desire was to watch the whole world all the time, and Man with the Movie Camera is a kind of demonstration of how the cameraman should be everywhere out in the world, and looking at things from every possible angle, and that these film editors should then take this material and put it together in all sorts of different ways to get it its truer meaning. I don't know if I agree with the part that it doesn't work here because it's in a fiction film. I mean, Vertov, again, as you probably know, hated fiction film and didn't want the new revolutionary Soviet Union to produce fiction film at all. I mean, he said, this is one of the things we as revolutionaries have to do is close down the studios and get rid of the film stars and just make films in the streets with everybody. I'm sure that kind of idea was very popular in Quebec, and even in English Canada, where with the documentary movements of the time. I mean, we have to remember this film's made in the late. It starts in 1969, is released finally in 1971. So we're in very revolutionary times, and so that idea was there. I think it probably is a way of dealing with something else I'm interested in too, which is how you film history and how you use documentary techniques if you want to look at something that in the past, and in reconstructing the old Quebec, the land of Mon Oncle Antoine, with this prying eye cinema verite. Is that appropriate? And all I can say is I think that's a very good question. I mean, maybe you should look at that world in the cinema of its own time, and make a fiction film of it in the Hollywood style of the 40s and 50s, and maybe that would be more appropriate for it. Then again, there's another adage that history always takes place in the past, but is always looked at in the present. And so, can you pretend not to be in 1970 when you're making a film in 1970?
So I first have a short question. The movie was made in 1971, and the story, what time does it go on? Is it the same period of time or like earlier?
No, the film. Jutra has said he thinks the film is set around the late 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s, when there's the first realization of change in Quebec. I think it looks more ambiguous than that, mostly because he still doesn't have enough money to make all of the. It's shot with people in a real town, and of course what he should have done is make all the women appear in 1940s hairdos and clothing, and the men shave their sideburns and long hair off, and he should have had enough money to take down everybody's TV antennas off the top of their roofs. But despite those faults, I think he's trying to make it appear as if it is this Quebec that had lasted, that was coming to the end of this 200-year history of repression that had been there. So I mean, there's mostly horse-drawn vehicles, for instance.
And now my question is, in the beginning of your speech, you talked about that part of this movie is that it wants to show what the country, Canada, was going through at that time in the eyes of the Renoir. So if you want to project that in real life, what was those issues or stuff that the country was going through at that time? Like Renoir was exploring the girl, the Carmen, the naked women, and the corpse. So what would be the real projection of this in the eyes of the country?
Well, are we talking about 1970 or the 1940s?
Well, the time that the movie
is set in.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, in the 1940s, life is and we're talking now about small-town Quebec, okay, because this isn't, I don't know if it's true in all of small-town Canada, but he certainly means it to be happening in Quebec. He says at the end of the beginning, there's a title that says, "In the Country of Quebec, Not So Long Ago." And so it's a look back at their country before the Quiet Revolution had taken effect, and it's ruled by tradition, by society that it's very much formally dominated by the church. People accept the fact that they're going to, in this town, that the men die from asbestos inhalation from working in the mine. The town shopkeeper is is the big man in the town because he, runs the shop, but the real economy of the town, the mine, is run by the boss, who comes down like a king from his castle and throws the little gifts out of the cart. And so the first sign of revolution is the two boys throwing snowballs at him, and the girl approving of this. And the other sign, the other little bit of symbolism, I think, that would be more apparent to Quebec at the time, is the image of the orphan. The two characters, both Carmen and Benoit, are orphans. Where she might as well be an orphan. Her father just comes to collect her pay and has abandoned her. And the orphan is a very familiar character in Quebec literature because the culture feels like it was abandoned by France. After the conquest in 1759, they were left as the only French-speaking people in North America, and France had abandoned them. So if you were Quebecois and you were looking at this film in 1970 and understood that it took place before the Quiet Revolution, I think you would recognize those things. As far as men and women and their relationship, it was all very, regulated, officially at least, by the church, and people married. There was had very large families, men were men and women were women, obviously, but it was all kept under the official regulations. People gossiping about anything that wasn't.
Yes, part of my questions are already, I think, answered, but can elaborate. We can elaborate more. You talked about the impact of documentary Quebec style on these movies. I took a course a couple of years ago about the history of Quebec, and in the course we discussed that there are several types of documentary. For example, in 1960, I remember there was a type of documentary in which people tried to show the medium of cinema when they interview with people. So they want to combine reality and fictions to make it a type of documentary. I cannot remember. I just want to show what type of documentary, when you are talking about it had impacted or influenced these movies, and how this style of documentary generally defines this period of Quebecois cinema. Because I want to know if we can, for example, if we look at current movies in Quebec, I see that, for example, the figure of fathers is lost, is becoming very important in Quebec. I'm just wondering, in this period, can we see anything similar? Can we, for example, describe a genre?
Yes,
find the patterns.
I think so. I think one of the things you see is looking for a kind of innocence and unself-conscious national characteristics. So, for instance, Michel Braul's what is best known film of this early period is a film called Les Raqueteurs, or The Snowshoers. And all the film is he and his crew go to Sherbrooke, Quebec, which is about 100 kilometers from Montreal. And every year in the middle of the winter, they have a kind of festival where they have a big snowshoe race. But they also have bands and parties. And the whole film is just filming different aspects of this, the race, the people, lots of shots of individual faces, the whole ritual as it goes on in this small city of Sherbrooke, Quebec. And he brought it back to the film board, and this is 1958, 59. And the older guys at the film board looked at it and said, "What is this? This is unfinished footage. You can't make a film like this. This is nothing. This is like home movies. The film board isn't going to distribute your home movies." And he said, "No, this is our culture, and we have to look at it." Right? And so that spirit, I think, is what begins Quebec cinema. there's a man named Pierre Perrault, whose specialty was he had done a radio show at one point where he would go up to remote places in Quebec and talk to people about the old ways of life. And he decided to make films. And so he and Perrault, again, go to a fishing community in the St. Lawrence. And years before, there had been a tradition where they, or a way of catching dolphins that swam down the river, and they would build a kind of trap for them with poles. And some of them remembered from their youth, the older men remembered seeing this and how it was done. And so the whole film is about him getting these men to do this again, to learn how to do it, and talking to each other and putting this together again. And this is the film that had to, one of the films that had to be subtitled in French for the French audiences, because they spoke a very old kind of French. And so they reconstructed this traditional life that had been lost, but they were always conscious of it as a reconstruction. And at the end of it, they catch one dolphin, and they, rather than eat it, they sell it to an aquarium in New York City, and they have to put it in the back of a truck in a tank of water, and they drive it from north of Quebec City to New York. And they show these guys going and talking to people in New York with their high school French, and then releasing the dolphin and going home. So it's saying, look, this is where we are now. I mean, we can't pretend that we're living in this old world, but this old world is still a part of us. As sophisticated and modern as we become, as revolutionary as we become, this old world is still part of our background. And I think that's what the tradition of the Quebec documentary of the time is saying. And that's why I think it influences Mon Oncle Antoine.
Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. When I read about the director, I found some facts that I actually attracted my attention. As we know that looking at the director and his personal or her personal life could help us to understand more about the movie. The first point is that the director was an assistant of Truffaut, as Amir says. I think that could be important point. You may want to talk about it because and talk about the impact of Truffaut or New Wave cinema on this particular film. And the second is that the director committed suicide.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's the point you want to.
Well, he it was even stranger than just committed suicide. We can start with that because the film he made before he made Mon Oncle Antoine was a very autobiographical film about it's called A Tout Prend, or All Things Thought About, All Things Considered, and it's about himself and his girlfriend in Montreal at the time, and their lives and their problems. And at the end of the film, his character walks to the river and throws himself in the river. And in the 1980s, I don't remember the exact year, but Jutre found he was suffering from a premature Alzheimer's disease. He was losing his mind, and he couldn't stand the thought of that, and he did exactly what his character did, and his body was found many miles from Montreal on the river some months later, actually. And so it was a great tragedy, but it was also his way of showing I suppose his commitment to his art, that he had seen this in himself at some point. As far as yes, he was very much involved with. First, he was an assistant to Norman McLaren. Then he knew Truffaut, he knew Jean Rouch. He was very much aware of what was going on in France and the New Wave in the early 1960s. He'd been there. He'd worked with a number of the people there. He'd seen the films, certainly, and so saw himself as perhaps working in that tradition. And even the last shot of Mon Oncle Antoine, many people have pointed out, it's a quotation of the last shot of the 400 Blows of Truffaut's film, which is a freeze frame of a boy's face.
Okay, I'm not sure if this answered it or not. First, thank you so much for your speech. I liked it a lot. The way that you talked about different points of view, the universal points of view versus the particularity of Quebec City and books to look through it in a very particular way. My question, and actually from the answers you gave to Amir about that there are some particular part of our life or our culture that are missed, and we need to film them somehow. This is exactly what's happening in our country, and I think that most of we had and have a lot of things that haven't been yet filmed or documented in any way. So my question is, what do you think of a successful national film? So what could be finally, and in particular, why you're interested to present, to have this presentation here for this film? So maybe these two could be.
Well, I think Mon Oncle Antoine is a very successful national film, but it's the nation would be more Quebec than Canada, and I think that's what it's intended to be, because I don't think he's trying to speak for Canada as a whole. That's not the experience he's coming out of. That's not the world in which he's documenting. The specific part, anyway, would be about Quebec, and the general part could be about Canada, but could be about a lot of other places as well. A lot of people growing up in small towns where things are very restricted, and where, at the end you have to leave or look back at them and go beyond them. The other part, though, I mean, of the film, of your question, though, and the film, I think the film kind of serves as a model for other cultures making films about their own Uncle Antoines, their own traditional experiences and beliefs, and the things that they too are growing away from. I don't think you're showing it in the series. I don't remember from the list, but there's a wonderful film called Agenauerit, the Fast Runner. Did I get that right?
Yeah. It's not in the chronologically. It's way later.
It's way later. Okay, but it's a way in which a group of Inuit decided to make a film about their own culture, and what they did was to make a film about one of their cultural legends, and they decided to script it. And when they went back to it, of course, they found that the story was told. That they interviewed 20 different people who knew the story, but they all knew a different story. And they said some of them told the story in 2 or 3 different ways, the same person. And so they had to really make their own story out of what everybody else had told them. And then they wrote it in their traditional language, and they tried to put together a kind of poetic version. So they even had to reinvent their language a bit. But the idea again is to look very carefully at what what their background was, and try to reconstruct it with the tools that they had. So I think what Mon Oncle Antoine does is encourage people in different ethnicities in Canada, elsewhere too, but certainly in Canada, gives them a model, right? A model which says, look, you do a story that's universal, the young person coming of age, young person finding the things wrong with their society, and then you make it specific to your society. You find in some ways Going Down the Road was like that, which is, you're showing, Going Down the Road is a great film in that respect, because it's another universal tale. That is, the 2 innocents from the country come to the city. And there's a lot of this, for instance, in the early English novel. And the innocent person comes to the city looking for, the streets paved with gold. and they have a terrible time. They find that they become very disillusioned, and they're cheated, and they become even more poor and desperate than they were in the country. They took that story and made it specific to the experience of people from outside of, well, in this case, in the maritime provinces, who, you know, were poor and were looking for a better life, and they come to Toronto, you know, the big mean Toronto, and have terrible experiences there because they, you know, they don't understand how different the place is and how difficult it is.
Okay, we have three
Can I continue
more.
with the question for one thing or
That's
no?
very quick. Very quick.
Okay, if you don't have.
Sure. No, we have three more, but like very big names. We can do it in the discussion. Let's make very quick.
Okay. Just wondering, why do you look at it as a successful movie? In my point of view, it's an amalgamation of all sorts of things going on in the field. There was the economic point of view where there was this guy with a carriage passing by the main street and throwing some gifts or whatever to people, and there were that was the culture of looking into sex, the culture of being grown up, the culture of, so you find a lot of things that just juxtaposing something somehow indifferently maybe together. So this is my question. What do you think of culture exactly? What do you mean by culture?
Well, that's an easy question. What do I mean by culture?
Yeah.
Raymond Williams, who's one of the great culture critics, early in his career, he wrote a book called Key Words, and he found 50 words that he found that every academic should be able to define. And when he came to culture, he said, "Boy, this is the hardest." And he said, and he went on. He talked about he got his definition. He said by going to almost to the biological definition of culture, which is what you have that helps things grow. You know, like in a petri dish, you put something in it, and a germ will grow in it. And he says that's what lets you grow as an individual is culture, and that's as close as a definition as he got. So, are you asking me to say what I mean?
No, because you're comparing, for example, these. Oh, sorry.
Well, I think culture is all those things. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, you said the economic, you said the sexual, you said, you know, the power structures. He is coming to realize all those things are his culture, and he's coming to perhaps and reject most of them, I think, as the film goes on. He's not going to have his life restricted this way. He's not going to allow this culture to make him who he is.
Okay, we could keep the rest for discussion. Connie, you have this.
Yes, I just wanted to add an answer to Nassim's question about what is a national cinema. I think one of the easiest definitions is a film in which the audience responds massively to questions of identity. And Mon Oncle Antoine played in the theaters, but the night that it played on television, it had half the population of Quebec tuned in that night. At least that's what I've read. And the same, the film that you're going to see next week, which is an entirely different film, played in a downtown Toronto theater for 6 months. So when that happens, I think you have to say the people recognize this as theirs. It's different from.
Connie, you had a question as well?
No, I just had a comment.
I want to ask a question, and then I give it to Nan as well, and to be the last question. So, going back to Nassim's question about national cinema, because of this, as you were saying about the metaphor, the child metaphor for old Quebec, or Quebec that was, you know, kind of victimized by its religion, the Catholic religion. So, my question is that in terms of Quebec unique national cinema, obviously Quebec is not a nation, recognized, but do we see anything specifically by Quebec directors defining their national cinema to be anti-Anglophone, purely Francophone, in a sense that I mean, this film I haven't watched, so I can't make a comment. But like, I'm gonna have to, I'm gonna have to present in 2 weeks, 3 weeks another Quebec film. That's what I'm asking. I want to know exactly whether this anti-English sentiment would precipitate in the work of Quebec directors who wanted to present their own version of Quebec national cinema.
Yeah, I think that at the beginning it certainly did. And there was a kind of, us or them, and we've got to get out of Canada to get rid, if we ever want to turn our back on Mon Oncle Antoine, we've got to get away from the English. I think it's more sophisticated than that today. I mean, I think there was a period when Quebec cinema was looking for, all the flaws in the Quebec character. I mean, Denis Arcand is a great example of this, because his films, I mean, you would think he'd be hated in Quebec because there's so many, he satirizes the worst in Quebec society all the time. But in fact, people see this as a kind of discussion, and they see this as a sign of strength, that he can talk about, not just, you can't just blame the English, we do a lot of stupid things ourselves. And his films are debated because he does those things. And a lot of, I think, Quebec cinema also looks at the sort of post-Antoine world and the characters who are the result of that very sudden and very dramatic revolution. Quebec goes from being perhaps the most religious culture in North America to being the least religious. It goes to a culture where everybody is married, every adult is either married or a priest or a nun, or where almost nobody gets married in Quebec now, and where everybody went to church. Now nobody goes to church. There's a very funny scene in one of our Kant's films where the church is trying to sell off all of its icons and its statues, and the priest is taking the woman from the auction house around, and he says, it was very strange when it happened. You'd think people would just lose interest over time. He said, no, it was like one Sunday in 1964, there was nobody in church, and they haven't come back since.